Hello, everyone. Mr. Eford here. I hope that you guys are doing well. It's been a while since we've done one of these videos, but I felt like today was an appropriate day for us to go back and do another video lesson. And that's all because we are getting ready to start a new unit on ancient Israel. And as always, when we start a new unit, I like to start with content vocabulary. There are some words that you need to know in order to be able to fully understand what we're going to be talking about as we move into this unit on ancient Israel. So that's what we're going to focus on today. We have 8 content vocabulary words for ancient Israel. Now, if you're one of my students, you guys know that on Canvas, I've also linked a document for you to record your definitions as we go through this. I've also linked the slideshow that we're going through here in class for you to be able to go back and reference if you need to later on to go back and see what the definitions of these words are. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started with content vocabulary for ancient Israel. All right, and our first word is really, really important, and it's going to create a distinction, a contrast between Israel and every other civilization that we have looked at so far up until this point. Okay, when we looked at Egypt and when we looked at Mesopotamia and when we looked at Phoenicia, we're looking at civilizations which are polytheistic. We've talked about that word before, but I'm going to go back and define it again. Remember that polytheism is a belief in many gods and goddesses, right? When you look at Egypt, Egypt believed in hundreds of gods and goddesses, right? You have Ra, the god of the sun. You have Isis, you have Osiris, you have Set, you have Thoth, you have all of these different gods and goddesses. And each of them was in charge of some aspect of nature. Mesopotamia, Babylon, all of these are similar in the fact that they are polytheistic. And very rarely have any of those civilizations ever ventured away from that to say, nah, there's not many gods, there's only one God. We had one pharaoh in Egypt, a guy by the name of Akhenaten, who tried to convert Egypt to monotheism, to worship the god Aten. It didn't work out so well, right? The people resisted that, and then eventually Akhenaten's grandson, King Tut, reversed everything and sent everything back to the old way of doing things with polytheism. Israel, though, is going to be very different, okay? Because Israel, from the moment that it was founded, all throughout its history has been monotheistic, which means that they believe in a single God, one God for all people, and not the existence of many, many deities. They only believe in one God. The faith of the Israelite people, the Hebrew people, is called Judaism. We're going to be talking about that in detail as we move forward. Because it's an important aspect of the history of the people of Israel. But Judaism started off as monotheism. It continues as monotheism, and it's a religion that's still very much alive and practiced today. Whereas a lot of the other religions, like the religion of the ancient Egyptians, people don't really worship Ra and Isis and Osiris anymore. The religion of ancient Babylon, again, is a dead religion. No one really practices that anymore. But the Judaic faith is still very much alive and well. And there are people all over the world who practice this faith and believe in this religion. Okay, so understanding that, we're going to kind of move forward and know that monotheism shapes a lot about the culture of the people of Israel as we move forward and we talk about their history. Okay, all right, our next definition goes along with the religious views of the people of Israel, and that is a prophet. Now, the Jewish people believe that certain religious teachers were called prophets, and that these prophets were sent by God to be his voice among the people. In other words, if God had a specific instruction for the people to follow or a message for them to listen to, maybe they needed to repent from their wicked ways. Maybe they needed to go in and wage war against a rival empire. Then this prophet would come along and deliver the message of God to the people. Okay. Not only did the prophets do that, but there was also a belief during this time that the prophets could predict future events, which is something, again, kind of unique to the Hebrew faith, to the Judaic faith. But we're going to be looking at some of these prophets a little bit later on and looking specifically at what they accomplished. Okay. All right. So those are the prophets. Again, a pretty unique component of the Judaic faith. All right, here we go. The 10 lost tribes. This is one of kind of the more interesting things that happens in ancient Israel. To kind of set up our definition here, you have to know that there are 12 tribes of Israel, and that the tribes split at one point in the history of the Jewish people. This was right after the reign of King Solomon. The two kingdoms of Israel split off, and you have the northern kingdom, which is the kingdom of Israel, and then you have a southern kingdom called the kingdom of Judea. Judea is made up of two tribes of the Jewish people, and Israel is made up of 10 tribes, right? So, over the course of the history of the Hebrew people, the Assyrians come in and conquer the northern kingdom. That's the 10 tribes of northern Israel. And when they do, the people are scattered. Okay, you see the first part of the definition here, the 10 tribes from the kingdom of Israel that were scattered to other parts of the world after the Assyrian Empire conquered them. Okay, so you've got people here who are scattered into, some of them are taken back as captives into Assyria. Some of them are scattered to places like Babylon. Some of them scattered to places like Egypt and Phoenicia. And basically, they're scattered all throughout the known world at this point in time. And we call them the 10 lost tribes because they never really came back home, right? After they were scattered into these places, they began to identify with the lands that they now lived in. The people who were scattered to Egypt started to identify as Egyptian. And so they started behaving like the culture of Egypt and worshiping the Egyptian gods. And so their culture was kind of diffused at this point into other areas. And they began to adapt and adopt the culture of the places that they had gone to. So what you see here at the bottom of the definition is really where we get into why we call them the lost tribes. They lost their identity. They no longer saw themselves as Jewish people. We see some of these people return into a part of Israel called Samaria. But to the people of Judea, the southern kingdom, they looked at the Samaritans as outcasts, right? They did not see them as fully Hebrew people or as part of the Jewish people at that point in time. So after the Assyrians come in and invade, these 10 northern tribes lose their identity. They've moved out. They're now living in other places and really identifying more with the people who they're living with now than who they were originally. Okay, so that's the 10 lost tribes of northern Israel. All right, nomad, this is a definition that we've already looked at before. It's not new, but it doesn't hurt for us to go back and look at it again. A nomad is simply someone who moves from place to place, right? They typically do not have a permanent home. Oftentimes when we looked at it in like the prehistoric period, people were looking for resources, right? Looking for food, looking to scavenge food from the wild. For Israel, it's a little bit different. You're still looking for resources, but not necessarily for you as a person. Many of the Israelites were shepherds, meaning that they looked after flocks of animals. And so they had to move their animals from one place to another in order to find food and water for their animals, for their flocks. Okay, so that's a nomad. Again, not new, but something that it doesn't hurt us to go back over again and make sure that everyone's aware of. All right, the Hebrew people. A couple of things make up who the Hebrew people are. They're the group who founded the kingdom of Israel, the nation of Israel. They're Semitic speaking, which means the language that they speak is an Arabic language. We call it Semitic language. And they're a member of the ancient Hebrew nation. In other words, they consider themselves descendants of Abraham. We're going to talk about that a little bit later and why that is important to the people of Israel. All right, here we go, guys. Judaism or Judaism, different people pronounce it different ways. This is the religion of the Hebrew people, starting out with a guy by the name of Abraham. We're going to talk about him and his family later on. But it's the religion that developed among the ancient Hebrews that grew into a world religion. I told you earlier that Judaism is practiced throughout the world today. So it is one of the major world religions that people do still practice here on earth today. The Judaic religion influenced two other major world religions, Christianity and the Islamic religion. Both grew out of Judaism. So again, the impacts of this particular religious emergence in the kingdom of Judah and in Israel, it impacted the world and is still impacting the world today, which is kind of a cool thing, right? All right, so that's Judaism. We're going to talk about this in greater detail later on, but you just need to know that this is the religion of the Israelite people. All right, here we go. First temple. This is also known as Solomon's temple because it was built by King Solomon. It's also called the Holy Temple. This is the most known contribution of King Solomon, who was the son of King David, one of the most important Jewish kings. And he made this as a contribution to serve as the symbolic center of the religion of the Hebrew people. People would come here to worship. They would come to offer sacrifices. and they came to this temple that Solomon built as a place of worship. Okay. All right, we're going to move forward here and continue on. We'll talk a whole lot more about King Solomon and Solomon's temple later on, but just to get a base understanding of what these things are, this is going to lead us into what we're learning over the next couple of days. All right, the Torah, okay? And I believe this is our last definition. We'll check in just a minute. But the Torah are the first 5 books of the Bible, as well as the most important book in the Judaic religion. These are books that are considered to be written by Moses. And they are the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They contain the story of the origin of the Hebrew people. It contains the laws of the Hebrew people, which are very, very important. We'll talk about those later on. It contains the story of the Exodus, which is where the Hebrew people were liberated from slavery in Egypt and led by Moses into what is called the Promised Land. And so a lot of the history of the Jewish people can be traced through the Torah. And we're going to be looking at some of the information that's contained within that as we move forward. All right, now I'm going to double check. I think that's it. We're going to hit the forward button. Yeah, that's it. All of our definitions there, 8 words that you need to know for our study of the Hebrew people. We're going to continue this on, and you guys are going to get some more lessons from me on the people of Israel and their contributions to modern society. But for right now, that's going to do it. Hope that you guys learned something from this. Until we get to see each other again, take care. Have a good afternoon, guys.